All right, guys. Tonight's notes is entitled the Reconstruction Period. So we're looking at the time period immediately following the Civil War from 1865 to about 1877. We know by now the Civil War is over, the Union has emerged victorious. And so what happens next? How does a country that was divided against itself, split down the middle in a sense, come back together? How does it repair itself after both the physical scars of this war, but also the emotional and the economic scars? You guys can see the political cartoon that we looked at in class the other day, showing Abraham Lincoln on the right and Andrew Johnson on the left, kind of working together to try and repair the wounds, mend the tear that had split the country in half. So Reconstruction itself is just the name for what happened in the South after the end of the war. And since Reconstruction is the biggest event taking place during this time period, we're just referring 1865 to 1877-ish as the Reconstruction Period. It's important to understand there is a lot of disagreement, even in the North, about what exactly should be done in the South. How should the Union treat these former Confederate states now that the war has been won? And Abraham Lincoln had a plan that called for forgive and forget. Abraham Lincoln wanted to be lenient with the South. He wanted to let former Confederate states be readmitted to the Union as states if they agreed to his conditions. First, they had to agree to end slavery. And he also wanted at least 10% of their voters to take an oath of loyalty to the United States. At least 10% of the people who were eligible to vote would have to take an oath saying that they promise they're loyal to the U.S. They won't advocate for secession going forward. In 1865, Congress sets up the Freedmen's Bureau. The job of the Bureau was to help freedmen, or former slaves, as well as poor whites in the South, by starting schools and distributing food, clothing, medicine, trying to kind of help the former slaves and poor whites get back on solid ground, hopefully trying to set the stage for some economic growth amongst these groups. However, we know in 1865, about a month after his second inauguration, Abraham Lincoln died. He was murdered, assassinated, and his vice president, Andrew Johnson, takes over the presidency. And Johnson comes up with a plan for the South that was even easier on the South than Abraham Lincoln's plan. That idea of a loyalty oath, Johnson said you didn't necessarily have to take this oath of loyalty to be readmitted into a state. He got rid of that percentage. You could still take an oath of loyalty, and that would guarantee that your property was restored. But they didn't need that oath of loyalty to be readmitted as a state. And Johnson's plan did very little to protect these former slaves, African Americans, in the South. All right. Now, Congress at the time was controlled by Republicans, and Republicans across the North were outraged at how nicely they thought Johnson was treating the South. Some Republicans in the North wanted to punish the South for causing the Civil War. They thought the South was to blame, and there needed to be repercussions for the Civil War, and South would have to pay for those. Many Republicans in the North also wanted Johnson to do more to protect the rights of newly freed slaves. And what we see, this leads to a major conflict between Johnson and Congress about whose ideas should lead Reconstruction. Eventually, after back and forth between these two groups, Congress is able to wrestle control of Reconstruction away from President Johnson. And they, the Republicans in Congress, are going to steer the course of Reconstruction going forward.